to do this work a couple of months ago, 6 weeks ago perhaps, to look at the potential implications of the COVID-19 crisis for some of the cities that we're supporting, including Baltimore. So this is focused on the Baltimore Metropolitan Statistical Area. And the teams from Oxford will talk about how they did the forecasts for the city. We've focused particularly on the shape of the potential recession, or the likely recession if we're not already in it, for your city, as well as the key industries and occupations most at risk during that economic downturn. And then the impact on Baltimore households, as well as different demographic groups within the city. So that's what we'll be covering today. I will hand over at this point to Hamilton and Michael from the Oxford Economics team, who will take you through the presentation. We do have a chat function on Zoom, so if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to use that. But I think also you should feel free just to ask questions as we go through the session. As I said, it's really intended for your benefits. You, I think, have all been muted for the call, so if you do want to speak, just make sure you unmute yourself before you ask your question. Okay, I'll hand over to Hamilton and Michael, and a big thank you to them.
Great, thank you, Gordon. Hi, everybody. My name is Hamilton Galloway. Just by way of a brief introductory background, I am the head of economic consultancy for Oxford Economics in the Americas. And I'm joined by my colleague, Mike Reed, who is a senior economist on my staff and really specializes in occupational labor market data and analytics. The work that we put together for Bloomberg, for Baltimore, and a number of other cities covers quite an array of both industry and occupation data and insight that gives a bit of a window into really what the potential decline and recovery would look like under two different scenarios. And really the goal of this report, and we're just covering a kind of a smaller portion of this report, but the goal is really to emphasize that, give you a lot of the data and the guidance that you need to actually help develop the types of economic responses and recovery plans in your area. I think it's really important to emphasize that the data and the insight that we're actually providing in this chart book is really meant to accompany your expert knowledge of the local economy in order to devise the type of strategies and solutions that are needed to navigate through the economic downturn and the recovery. So this could take the form of a lot of different types of coordinated efforts with public-private partnerships, post-secondary institutions, business networking groups, social support organizations, and so on. And really just use this data and this context to help have maybe a bit more of foundational conversations to help steer that direction. I am going to kind of race through some of the introductory pieces because I think a lot of the worthwhile content and information is in the data and the insight that we're providing. But there's a couple of things I just want to help kind of create a bit of a framework and understanding of what we did in this project. So the scenarios that we looked at are drawn from Oxford Economics Global Economic Model. So this gives us a good understanding of what's happening at the two-digit NAICS level, or the two-digit industry sector classification level within the modeling framework. But in order to help kind of distill down and understand a little bit more of the composition of industry sectors, as well as the occupations that are employed within those industries, we further broke out the industry sector viewpoints of those two-digit NAICS outlooks within the scenario modeling. So, for example, a 27% decline in professional service jobs within the Baltimore area is not actually broken out into the same trajectory and outlook at the sub-industry level. We do provide the Baltimore level data for these more detailed compositions of the professional services sector, things like engineering services, graphic design, and consulting services, and so on. And then from that, we further distill those effects into occupations, household characteristics, demographics, and so on. Just to give a little bit of quick background, we did run two different scenarios. One is that we're going to be covering in this call is basically what we're calling the muted scenario, or what is referred to as A1. These were developed by McKinsey. The second is what McKinsey calls an A3 scenario, which is a much stronger growth rebound. In the A3 scenario, outputs are what's ultimately provided in a more comprehensive slide deck that was provided to Baltimore. But this just gives a bit of an understanding of what the scenario framework essentially looks like. One of the things that we're very cognizant of here at Oxford Economics is things are changing very rapidly in the economic environment, and so as you know, conditions change, we want to stay as close to an updated outlook for the U.S. economy, at least to help maybe guide a little bit more of how things might be distilled down at the local level. So we're constantly having kind of ongoing revisions to our national outlook, which has more recently pointed to a bit of a stronger recovery than originally anticipated just even a few weeks ago. And this recovery is starting to take a little bit more of a checkmark shape, but ultimately community recoveries and the scenarios are going to be based on a lot of other factors, such as social distancing and reopening plans and so on. One of the other things that is maybe a little helpful to take into context is how the COVID-19 cases are unfolding within your particular area. Looking at the New York Times data, the COVID-19 number of new cases is declining or is stabilized across the metro area. So this is much better than some of the neighboring parts of Pennsylvania and Virginia that are still experiencing the types of increases in pockets of new cases. Driving into the data, I think this gives a fairly good snapshot to look at a bit of the comparison between the two different scenarios that we modeled before we get into more of the specifics of the underlying industry and occupation characteristics that are underneath this. As I mentioned, we're covering A1, which is that muted recovery, which is the dark blue line, which sees a bit of a prolonged lockdown type of a scenario and a slower recovery, both in terms of GDP and jobs. But ultimately, the idea here is by providing the context of two different scenarios, a stronger recovery versus a muted recovery, this provides a bit of a bookend of what the potential recovery in the Baltimore MSA might look like. Kind of distilling this out a little bit further before we cut into more of the details and doing a bit of a comparison between the A1 and the A3 scenario, looking at changes in real GDP by industry sector. We provide a couple of snapshot points of how much the decline and potential recovery will happen between 2 points in time. So one being Q4 of 2020 this year, what that decline looks like from a base period of Q4 2019. And then from another standpoint, Q4 of 2021, and how much the decline or how much marginal recovery has occurred between that period compared to the baseline of 2019. It's worth mentioning that in the scenario A1, that muted recovery scenario, you're still looking at largely a net decline compared to the 2019 Q4 baseline across pretty much all sectors. In the scenario A3, that growth rebound, that stronger rebound in recovery, you still see a lot of net decline through Q4 of 2020, but starting to see some recovery and growth. I'm going to say growth rebound above and beyond that Q4 2019 baseline by the end of 2021. So I think this helps to at least give some context of what the potential outlook could be under different scenario conditions. And obviously, as we get more information in the coming weeks and months, we can better hone in on what that potential recovery trajectory would look like, and perhaps maybe more accurately reflect or reconcile that information with what these scenarios are portraying within your communities. And I will apologize for the background noise. My building is having apparently quite a bit of work being done in the common space, so you'll just unfortunately have to bear with me for a few additional minutes. In the employment side of things, the outlook is a little bit more bleak. Even in the growth rebound scenario, employment still lags GDP recovery, and I think this is something that's very important to keep in mind, as it will impact the job market in the Baltimore MSA region overall, and obviously would require perhaps further support for job transitioning, as long-term unemployment risk would ultimately increase, regardless of the A1 or A3 scenario. Real quick, before I jump into a bit of the more focused details on the industry side of things, are there any questions at just kind of that high-level view? If you're on mute, by all means, you can take yourself off of mute, or you can write a comment, and I'll kind of keep tabs on any comments that come in to address any of those questions. So looking at most impacted sectors, what we have done in the slide deck that is kind of the main slide deck that we're providing is we've looked at kind of the most impacted versus the most resilient industry sectors from a two-digit NAICS standpoint. This is largely modeled on employment. So which sectors have seen the strongest impact on employment? What does that decline in recovery look like? And there were some rules that we had in place. We didn't want to pick sectors that didn't have very much employment, so there had to be some level of overall composition of the labor market that sector actually represents in order to satisfy some of that criteria. But within Baltimore, the most impacted sector we found to be the professional services sector. So we saw the scenario itself modeled a decline of about 8% between 2019 and 2020, which compares to about a 9.1% decline across the US and 8.7% decline in Maryland. A little bit better of an outlook compared to a lot of other geographies. Within the employment side of things, though, you see a decline of about 27%, so about 35,000 jobs over that same period, which ultimately compares to about 15.9% decline across the US and about a 27% decline overall in Maryland.
Hamilton, it's Gordon, why do you think the job losses under this muted scenario are so significant compared to US and Maryland?
I think the job losses in this sector compared to the US and Maryland overall, I think it has to do a lot of the industry sector composition for professional services. So when we start thinking about the types of jobs that might be a little bit more closely tied to government spending or other things like that could be adversely impacted in lockdown scenarios, or anything that might be tied a bit more toward supporting of manufacturing activities and all that, and the connectivity that exists between those sectors, there could be a bit of headwinds that sector would ultimately face in terms of the job. So while the output might be largely maintained, there might be some reconfigurations or adjustments within the labor market as a result.
Another question. I guess could you explain why the GDP does not dip kind of in correlation with the employment dip? Why are they not more parallel?
It's a good question. I think there's some mechanics taking place in the model that is ultimately looking at a bit more of the resiliency of output that can take place within the professional services sector. So there are capacities and capabilities for work from home and all of that I think can help sustain a bit more of the output for professional services. So the types of jobs that don't have to commute into an office or a location that can still be run from home. I think helps to maybe mitigate a bit of the output side of things. On the employment, I think there's a bit of a challenge in terms of the types of perhaps jobs that are tied to, I'm going to say, the types of professional services that are supporting other industry sectors that are maybe more adversely affected by the crisis. So I think if we kind of segment, professional services is a pretty big category. You're covering a lot of different subsectors within professional services. And some of the types of jobs that, or the industries that are contained within professional services might be more or less resilient, that are higher output oriented versus others that might require maybe more labor inputs in order to maintain that level of output, that would be facing a bit of those stronger headwinds.
Can you comment just on what it means to be in the sort of what it means to have a job lost? I couldn't tell what, so for example, I guess two scenarios. One, employee worked in Baltimore City, now is working from home in, Howard County outside the MSA. Is that I couldn't tell from your prior comment whether that was a job lost or not. And similarly, people who were furloughed in the current, who are using the UI system, hopefully temporarily, or at least more we've obviously deputized UI in a different way than we've used it in the past. Are they, if you're furloughed, is that job lost, or is that figure in any of this?
Yeah, I think, the model itself doesn't distinguish between furloughed versus unemployed, versus job loss. So I think I think that's obviously a shortcoming that a lot of economists are struggling with these days anyway, is understanding that fundamental difference between a furlough versus a job loss. But the way that we're treating a job loss in this context is the worker is not working. So that employment is dropped. And I think the furlough nuance is unique in this situation, where the person still is, so they're tied to the labor market, but they're not working. And I think in this case, the employment would ultimately reflect probably the furloughed workers as well. Since it's kind of tied to the overarching macroeconomy. But that's a good question. I don't really have a clear window and insight to that, and the model itself wouldn't really distinguish between the two. As we unpick this a little bit further in terms of understanding some of the underlying industries, the more detailed industry sectors that are coinciding with professional services, at the 4-digit NAICS level, you see a lot in computer systems and design and related services, architectural engineering services, management and technical consulting services, and so forth and so on. The data that we're showing in this table, once again, this is not tied to the dynamic decline or recovery of the model. It's really designed to give a little bit of a better insight of the composition of industries that make up this sector, as well as providing a lot of additional context of competitiveness and value that's generated through the operations of those industry sectors. So real quick, given the amount of folks on the line, some of you might be familiar with what a jobs location quotient is, but for those of you who are not, the location quotient, the LQ, is a relative measurement of concentration for an industry sector in your region compared to the average across the US. So we consider a job LQ of anything greater than 1 would be more concentrated in your area as an industry sector than it would for the average US region. And areas with high LQs tend to be more indicative of competitiveness within your region overall, compared to the national economy. So kind of with that in terms of a framework, LQ is a helpful measurement just to understand the comparative benefits or competitiveness of those regions or the industries within your regions overall. And then the additional columns looking at job multipliers, GDP multipliers, and income multipliers helps to give a bit of a better understanding of how much additional value or jobs are being generated through the employment of one person in that particular industry classification. We created a bit of a color coding system to give a better understanding of which ones are a bit stronger versus a bit weaker overall in terms of comparative advantage, that competitiveness, as well as multiplicative effects within the economy. And then to the right of that, when we're looking at establishment size, giving a better understanding of what the size of establishments are at the 2-digit industry level. So this is just professional services, not a breakout of the 4-digit level. But you can see in this case, you have a much higher proportion of small to medium-sized businesses within the region compared to the large businesses. And this might actually get a little bit closer to the question that you were asking earlier, which is you see here that there's a lot of small businesses that make up the higher proportion of establishments within the region. And if the small businesses are facing a lot of economic headwinds, it could have some downward effects on the overall jobs for these smaller businesses. So likewise, looking at strongest performing sector in both from the GDP and employment side of things, healthcare and social assistance saw a fairly strong employment and economic growth rebound. And actually from an overall GDP growth standpoint, I think the effects on the industry is a bit more of a hiccup than it is necessarily a significant downturn. But conversely, on the other side of that, on the employment side, you see a lot of decline in the employment, at least initially for a short-term period of time before you see that recovery. And I think a lot of this goes back to the similar situations with the professional services side of things, where lockdowns are preventing some of these healthcare facilities from operating, especially if there's kind of smaller physicians and other types of care facilities that are separate from large institutions and hospitals. But ultimately, as the social distancing and lockdowns become more relaxed and you start moving into various phases, the demand for healthcare services is still there, as well as social assistance, and you see a much sharper rebound within that sector overall.
So if I'm reading this right-hand chart correctly, this is basically saying we have a serious dip, but only for about a year. Am I reading that correctly?
Yes, for about a year. You're looking at kind of almost a recovery to pre-COVID levels happening by about Q2 2021. So about a year, yes. Similar to the most impacted sector,
I'm sorry, is that in the good, whatever you call it, the high growth one or the low growth one? I forget what
this is the muted recovery. So this is the low growth one. This is kind of
so
when we're talking
okay,
about
so even
strong,
in the low growth. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Great.
The high growth, it's even faster, to be frank. Faster in terms of getting back to pre-COVID levels, but also getting back to the long-term growth trajectory that the sector was already on to begin with.
Great.
Once again, giving a little bit more of that detailed outlook and profile, you see that the largest number of jobs are generated through general medical and surgical hospitals. So hospitals as an industry is really a significant portion of the overall jobs within the region itself. It has a fairly significant concentration compared to kind of the national average, so that it's very much a healthcare hub, if you will, and you guys already know this, and you know it better than I do. And the job multipliers and the value multipliers and the income multipliers, are fairly average for the industry sector overall, but there's a strong value attached to it. Before I transition into the occupation side, were there any additional questions on the industry bit? And once again, we'll have a lot of, in your main deck, you'll have other data and information that'll coincide with this, but this is more of a snapshot to get a better sense and understanding of kind of what's contained in that main deck.
So Hamilton, it's Gordon from Bloomberg. So just in terms of kind of thinking through the implications of this, and we'll support Colin as he develops continues to develop the Baltimore Together plan. Obviously, for industries that have a large number of small businesses that are going to be hard hit and slow to recover, those are areas where that plan should be focusing on loans, grants, technical assistance, and other supports. So industries like real estate, manufacturing, obviously retail, administrative services being key areas there. And then I think also on the business development side of that plan, the plan has identified some key opportunity sectors, industrial, logistics, life sciences, cyber, hospitality. Some of those are going to recover and lead the recovery quicker than others. So some like manufacturing, hospitality will struggle a bit more. So again, how we can think through that in terms of the way that the plan rolls out its programming. We'll be thinking about how we can help and support Colin building off some of the learnings from this chart book. So just a couple of pieces there in terms of context.
Yeah, I think somebody mentioned you're working on updating your SEDS too. Was that something I heard at the start of this call?
Yes, that's right. Colin mentioned that we have a very consultative process with broad sectors and communities to update the SEDS plan.
Okay, and this is this kind of coinciding with the EDA criteria for SEDS?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think to that point, a lot of the data and the content that you'll find it in the chart book itself, the full chart book, will certainly help create a bit more of that quantitative foundation that can help guide a bit more of the discussions you're having with your stakeholders and various groups within those industry sectors, as well as other types of organizations and agencies that you would be engaging with to help just kind of set a more of a level playing field to understand what is going on within your economy, what the potential outlook for the types of scenarios that might be evolving and changing within the Baltimore MSA, to think a little bit more about how you could apply this content, this information towards those strategies, but also use this data to help kind of fortify or reinforce why the strategies that you're putting in place are the ones you're establishing. So with that, I do want to pass the baton over to my colleague, Mike Reed, who is going to walk through a bit more of the occupation perspective, as this, I think, is as it's closely tied to the industry perspective. It has a lot of additional implications in terms of the workforce. So over to you, Mike.
Great, thanks, Hamilton. As Hamilton noted, this kind of ties in with our industry perspective, and we're going to present here the A1, the more muted outlook. But in the broader deck, you will have access to both scenarios as well as all detail for all occupations, which we did project. So I just wanted to mention that up front. So looking at the next slide, you can see here we've broken this out by the major occupation groups, and the most impacted group in the Baltimore metro area is expected to be the office and administrative support roles. That likely ties in with what we were seeing from the industry perspective, where a lot of those roles will sit within professional services. But we're also seeing a lot of roles, I think, that aren't surprising, that are going to be impacted by this. For example, sales, where you're going to have a lot of retail sales jobs lost, food prep and serving. So a lot of the restaurants and bars that are closing are staffing jobs in that area. But if you go to the next slide, Hamilton, I think the key takeaway here and what is going on is right here, low income, low skill jobs are the most impacted. And here in Baltimore, we estimate that the low skilled jobs will account for about 65% of the total job losses to the end of this year. And that's fairly consistent across all the cities that we're looking at. But I think what's important to understand and also to plan for in this recovery is that the alignment between the job opportunities that will come out of this recession will not be the same as those jobs that are lost in this recession. So a lot of attention should be paid to retraining and re-educating a lot of these workers to align them with those future opportunities. But by and large, I think some of the trends we're seeing, and there's been a lot published on this, some of those jobs in the green bubbles are those where a lot of the workers have the ability to work from home and are able to continue business as usual, such as we're doing here. But a lot of the jobs that are lost require those in-person interactions, which has prohibited those workers to returning. And depending on the success of the various phases of reopening will determine the rate at which those jobs are recovered. If you jump to the next slide, I touched on this earlier. I just really want to stress this this point that the jobs that are lost, you can see again, they're mostly going to be jobs that require only a high school diploma or below when looking at educational requirements. And in the recovery, not all of those jobs are going to come back. In fact, most of the opportunities in this recovery are going to be those high skill jobs that require some type of college degree. So the difficulty is going to be, how do you reach out and identify these workers who don't have the right credentials, and how do you train them, and how do you provide them with an opportunity to get some of those jobs that are emerging in the recovery where they might need a certificate, where they might need an associate's degree. And frankly, a lot of people don't have 4 years, they don't have 2 years to go and get these degrees. So a key part of a recovery plan is going to be thinking about how you can time some of these programs to match people based on their skill sets to those job opportunities. Thinking about stacking credentials, thinking about alignment of skill sets. And I will say, Bloomberg, I believe, is planning to provide you also with some job posting and skills data from Burning Glass, and that will allow you to align the skills and education associated with those to our occupation forecast here. So that's going to be a really useful tool for you all to use. But here, looking at the Baltimore Metro, those workers who are in jobs that only require a high school diploma or less, about 18,000 of them will not have a job during this recovery, and that's looking out to 2024.
Could you just explain further what the education recovery gap means?
Sure. So if you think about when you apply for a job, there are typically education requirements associated with that. If you want to become a surgeon, for example, you would need a medical degree. If you want to become a lawyer, you need a Juris Doctor degree, a law degree, and so on and so forth. So some jobs only require a high school diploma, some require a post-secondary certificate. This is looking at those various education qualifications by occupation, the drop during this recession, the number that will be lost, and the subsequent growth of those jobs coming out of the recession, so the jobs that are recovered. So there will be certainly job opportunities at the higher end of the labor market for skilled jobs, But at the low end, there's going to be less opportunity. This means you're going to have those folks with college degrees are going to become increasingly important to the region. So Hamilton, if you hop to the next slide, I think another important component to understand when looking at this is also some of the characteristics associated with the workers who are in these various jobs.
Yep. One second. Looks like Frank Knott has his hand raised.
Yeah. I want to. There's some pretty significant economic information on consumer purchasing that's indicating that the major recovery so far has been in lower income family spending, and there has not been a recovery in the spending in the economy at the higher end of the income levels, which represents a very significant part of the consumer economy. So my question is, how much of this analysis considers that reality, in that because we have so many people, we have all the losses are in the low end jobs significantly, but the recovery is going to be dependent on how fast that upper end income stream spends their disposable dollars. And the data is showing now that they're not spending at all. And that's being driven by the fact that they are not going to spend until they are assured that there's a cure, a vaccine for COVID.
Mike, you want me to take first crack at that one?
Yeah, I think one thing to keep in mind is that right now what we're seeing is a lot of government support for those folks who have lost jobs. But a lot of those benefits are going to expire soon. For example, unemployment insurance. So where the consumer spending will be important in this recovery is going to be at the higher end of this of the jobs perspective, if you will, the higher skilled jobs. And more it's those folks who do have jobs will need to go out and spend their money in order to help this recovery. There's a lot of uncertainty about consumer confidence if people aren't able to go out and do everything from grocery shopping as they did previously, to getting haircuts, to getting their cars repaired. It's going to prevent the opportunity for some of those middle and low skill jobs to return.
Okay, what I'm asking though is the assumption you're making in this not as robust recovery scenario. Are you assuming that, because when I see a return in about a year to a year and a half on the data in the prior slides, that's indicating to me that you're making assumptions that there's going to be a very high rate of return in consumer spending at the higher income level, which is not showing up and is not indicated?
I don't think this chart is showing that exactly. This is just showing the job requirements, the educational requirements that are associated with each job.
I'm talking about
if you were to kind of unpick what it means a little bit, there are some other factors going on. For example, this situation may accelerate trends toward automation, for example.
So let me go ahead and maybe address this question through the GDP and employment data from that first one. So the A1 muted recovery type of scenario, you're looking at a bit more of that return to at least the pre-COVID level on just GDP around the end of 2022. So you got a bit of an extended recovery time frame and period that still needs to be contended with. On the job side of things, we're actually forecasting that the return to pre-COVID level in jobs actually isn't going to fully return and recover under that muted recovery scenario. So to your point that there are severe implications on consumer spending and that consumption side of things is fairly spot on. I think in the muted recovery that is actually really trying to address that downturn in consumption behavior, that downturn in overall consumption. And just to kind of bolster that standpoint, we've actually done some analysis on this within Oxford Economics, just to get a better understanding of what the kind of what that implication is, even for those who have kept their job but are taking lower salaries as a result of that. And I think there's some things that we need to maybe get a better understanding of, both nationally and within specific regions, is the fact that in this particular recession, which is kind of counter to what has happened in a lot of other recessions, people have been more willing to take payroll cuts. They've been more willing to take salary reductions, which is actually reducing the amount of overall income and potential spending that's actually in the economy. And we model that to be about, on an annualized basis, just in kind of the more depths of this recession, to be about $1.3 trillion of lost income by workers on an annualized basis, not entirely, but if you take all of this and take it out over 12 months, you're talking about an overall reduction of $1.3 trillion in consumer spending and income capability. So to your point, I think some sectors perform better because there's just higher demand for them. They're more integrated within the economy. They see a bit of a stronger resilience to the downturn. Other sectors don't look as good. And it's those sectors that might be a little bit more tied to consumption spending, especially consumer products and other types of consumer services that are going to likely struggle. And it's the jobs and those lower skilled jobs that are more heavily tied to that type of consumption spending.
Okay, thank you. And I'm on the SEDS team, and Paul, I just think this needs to be. This particular issue needs to be factored into our thinking.
Frank, what we can also send you, the two scenarios from McKinsey, the A3, A1, we can send you the assumptions that underpin those two scenarios. A3 is obviously the more positive one, both the epidemiological and economic assumptions there. But the A1 scenario that we're talking through was the one that international leaders indicated, several thousand around the world indicated they thought was the most likely. So we're focusing on that one. But obviously, to your point, what you just discussed may push us more in that more negative, muted direction, and that certainly was what most leaders thought would be most likely. So, but we can send you the underpinning assumptions that for each of the scenarios.
Thank you.
Right, so jumping back into some of the occupation and household perspective, one thing we did was calculate the risk of job loss by race ethnicity using the employment profiles of occupations in the Baltimore region. And here we're finding that this recession is going to impact Hispanic workers the most in Baltimore relative to other groups here. But still keep in mind, as a measure of volume, you can see that white workers represent the biggest group, and that's really just a reflection of kind of the broader demographics in the region. So jumping into the next slide, we're going to look at here the most impacted occupation group, and then we'll also talk about the strongest performing occupation group later on. But first and foremost, we've identified office and administrative support jobs as those that will be most likely to be lost during this downturn in Baltimore. So that would include things like secretaries, administrative assistants, customer service reps, and so on. So the key here, I think, in looking at this particular table is, going out to the end of 2021, we're still looking at only about 90% or so of most of these jobs coming back. So meaning about 10% of these workers will not have jobs, over the next year or two. On the next slide, we provide a bit more of a background and demographic profile of some of these workers, just again to help you think about who these workers are and how you might reach out to them. Picking on customer service reps, for example, you can see it's a low skill job. Likely it employs a lot of entry-level workers, and especially young workers. You can see there's a 23% share of workers between the age of 16 and 24 for this particular job. So this job is going to impact a lot of younger workers. Conversely, some other jobs may employ a lot of older workers. We provide a lot more of a detailed breakout in the data you will be receiving, but just for the purpose of this presentation, we provide things like the share who are non-white in a particular occupation group, those who don't have a college degree, the percent who are male and female, and another measure which I think is important for some of the cities we've been talking to, especially some of the bigger cities with large public transport systems. We provide the share of workers who use public transport to get to work. So there's a lot of information on here, and as I mentioned, you'll have all of this information with more detailed breakouts for all occupations. But we're just highlighting here some of these key characteristics. Are there any questions on the data that is displayed here? Okay, doesn't sound like it, so we'll jump to some of the stronger performing occupation groups in here in Baltimore. It happens to be healthcare support occupations. And one thing we talked about before are the job opportunities coming out of this recession. What will they be? And this is one particular group that I think should be focused on. And these aren't necessarily high-skilled jobs, so this might be a good group in particular where you might be able to provide some training and education to displaced workers to kind of start their careers in the healthcare field. You can see that most of these jobs will have more opportunities by the end of 2021 compared to where we were prior to this recession. So that's indicative that there will be a demand for these jobs. But a lot of these jobs will require, if you hop to the next slide, Hamilton, so some of these will require some amount of training, but not necessarily a college degree, if you will. So this again would be a good opportunity to help workers, say, who lose their job as a customer service rep, those who lose their job as a retail salesperson, as a cashier, for example. They'll have ample opportunity for jobs in these fields where they might only need, say, a certificate to get them into there. And then once they're in this field, it does become a lot easier to kind of stack those credentials and continue a career path, within this field. You can see here there's some similarities in terms of skill level and wages. And again, we provide all of those types of characteristics to kind of help you understand, who these people are and whether or not they need a college degree, how they're getting to work, and so on and so forth. So Hamilton, I think the next slide and the last slide we'll cover today looks at the household perspective. And just a few notes on this up front. What we did was to take the probability of expected job loss by occupation and apply that to households in the Baltimore metro region. this modeling assumes that households are not migrating within this time, and we're not making any assumptions about which of those households go on to apply for government income assistance. However, keep in mind, this is meant to show the likelihood, if you will, that there will be a big need for government income assistance due to the fact that about 86,000 households are at risk of falling below the living wage threshold in this recession. What we did is we combined our, as I mentioned, the occupational job loss with the MIT living wage calculator to get this. Most of the, in fact, most of the job losses will be for high income or kind of medium wage workers falling below that living wage. So that 86,000 is in addition to the nearly almost 8,000 households that are already receiving some form of government income assistance in the Baltimore metro region.
I'm not clear on one point here. Are these numbers referring to what's going to happen during the 1-year dip that we talked about earlier, or is this a permanent shift?
No, this is showing the likelihood at the trough. So kind of looking at the around the end of 2020, what is the likelihood that either everyone or one worker in a given household would be out of a job, and what the impact would be on their household income.
Thank you.
So I do want to, we still have some time left to address any additional questions or get some thoughts or whatever that we can help you with. Just by way of a quick note that coincides with this particular slide deck, and actually the chart book that you'll get is a guidebook that goes through each of the specific metrics that are presented to provide a little bit more of a context and definition of what those metrics are designed to illustrate and show you, so you can kind of use that to reconcile against your own tacit knowledge and your own local knowledge of the Baltimore MSA. And Gordon, I didn't know if you had some other thoughts or some other feedback.
Yeah, thanks, Hamilton, and thanks, Mike. So again, in the same way, we'll be happy to see how we can support Colin as he thinks through the workforce development, workforce supports bit of the Baltimore Together plan. And as Hamilton said, we'll be providing in the next couple of weeks Burning Glass data, Burning Glass, a jobs database, which supplements this report that looks at some of the skills pathways and the career pathways. So for those people likely to lose their jobs in areas like administration, sales, food prep, transportation, what's the quickest routes to get them through training and into a job that's going to be recovering more quickly, like a medical assistant, for example. And so providing information and advice on that to get people into what are called lifeboat jobs as quickly as possible, but then also onto career pathways to medium wage jobs. I'll maybe ask Colin just to give a reaction in a moment to how he proposes to use this and how he would like to take the discussion forward. But before I do hand over to him, just a couple of comments. Firstly, if you have any additional questions, please send them to Maisha. She was the one who invited you to this session, so she's on the meeting invite. We will make sure that we either answer them or get them to the Oxford team to answer any questions that you have. This is your report. We have handed this chart book over to Colin and to the team. It's yours to distribute and use as you see fit. There is, in addition to the main book, an annex that provides a lot more context. So if you're interested in a particular occupation or a particular industry sector, we've got that all in the annex. It's a big document, a couple of 100 something slides. And we've also provided to you the underlying Excel spreadsheets. So if you have economists and you want to manipulate this data for your own purposes and for your plan, again, you'll have access to those spreadsheets. So this is your information. We'll send it, because it's quite a big file, in probably a box or a Dropbox folder but anyone who would like to get access to that, we're very happy to make that available to you. So why don't I, that maybe hand over, Colin, any thoughts or comments in terms of, or questions that you have for the team during the remaining kind of 4 or 5 minutes that we have.
Sure, thank you, Gordon, and I'm now unmuted, so apologize for earlier. I was muted twice and didn't figure that out, but thanks, Paul, for jumping in. I want to thank Gordon and the Oxford Economics team and Bloomberg Philanthropies for working with Baltimore and giving us this data and all the assistance that you're offering. It's really, really beneficial for us, and I know we have members of our team, both in-house and folks helping us with our SEDS plan, who probably will want to dive into the spreadsheet. So, you know, I think there's probably a lot of questions that we need to answer, and then, as you said, adapt this to the local things that are happening here. For instance, we have some very large retail projects that are literally under construction and starting to hire. So I'll be very curious to see how those affect the local economy. I mean, in some ways it's good in terms of moving workers from potentially restaurants to, I think we now have 3 or 4 large grocery stores that will be opening in the next couple weeks, if not sooner. But if spending doesn't continue, you know, hopefully those retailers can survive this 1-year downturn. So there's some, you know, very local, hyper local things that we'll look at with that. But again, I just want to thank you, and we'll make sure that the slide deck goes out. I think I'll get the latest and greatest. I think it might be slightly different than the one I had, and then we'll get the link for the recording, and we'll make sure that anybody that wants access to it can have access to it.
Great. Colin, real quick, this is Hamilton. One thing to maybe just mention on what you were referring or reflecting on the retail side of things, I think it would be maybe helpful to get a sense of where the job displacement will be happening at kind of the retail and restaurant level across the economy with respect to the geographic location of those grocery store and retail centers that are under development. As you maybe saw from one of those earlier slides, and we'll have other slides that more closely reflect the retail side of occupations as well. But there's a fairly large segment of younger workers, workers of color, women, all of that kind of stuff. But also there's that last column in there that actually describes a bit of what percentage of those occupations, workers in those occupations, utilize public transport. And if the displacement of the occupations, the workers in certain sectors, you know, might be happening in a part of the Baltimore MSA that is not where some of those retail jobs are going to be emerging as a result of the projects, it might be something you want to take into consideration of where that alignment geographically might be taking place, or where it might be somewhat disconnected.
Yeah, it's a good point. We struggle with transportation, and you know, we hear that a lot from employers and employees. And obviously, you guys are looking at the MSA, so my guess is that's going to be even more challenging in the surrounding jurisdictions that are more suburban than potentially some of the locations where development's happening in the city, where it's a little bit closer to transportation. But that said, it's still a challenge.
Okay, I want to make sure we're respectful of people's time, and a couple of people have had to drop off. So there was a huge amount of information thanks to the Oxford team. You may be feeling a little bit overwhelmed at the moment and trying to think through kind of what the net of this is. I mean, we're looking at a downturn under the more positive scenario to starting to bounce back in 2021, under the more negative not until 2022, and under that more negative scenario, somewhere in the range of 176,000 jobs, which will be lost, not a number of which will not return once the economy is back to normal again, with a number of industries and occupations particularly hard hit. So, as I said, any questions, please send them through via Maisha, and we'll make sure that we get you some answers. In the meantime, I hope you did find it helpful. Again, thank you to the Oxford team. We appreciate all your work on this and your time this afternoon. And thank you to all of you for joining us. Again, we hope this is helpful as Baltimore plans its response and recovery over the next few weeks and months.